We are back. It is time for a June wrap up. I had a really good reading month in June. It was my birthday month, so I expected to do a little more shopping than I normally do, but I obviously still have two very full bookshelves, so I didn't do much of a book shopping trip like I normally do, so there will be no book shopping hauls. But I read a really good variety of books. I didn't have any 5-star reads, but I didn't have any 1 or 2-star reads really, so I can't complain. So let's start off with the novels I read this month. The first book I read was Ali Wong's Dear Girls. This was part memoir, part tell you a lesson or moral of her story after each life episode. For those of you who don't know, Ali Wong is an Asian comedian who is a woman, and comedians don't have a ton of Asian representation, and they also don't have a lot of women representation. So reading this memoir, she highlights both those facts and how they intermingle and kind of how they sometimes butt heads with each other. So that perspective I really enjoyed. On the other hand though, I don't really love that kind of comedy. Ali Wong's approach to comedy is very vulgar, very a little childish, if I'm being honest, a little teenage boy. She makes a lot of sex jokes. She makes a lot of racial Asian stereotypes jokes. And I don't really find that comedy funny, but I'm sure someone does, and obviously a lot of people do because she's a very famous comedian. Also, trigger warning if you get nauseous easily. She definitely learned a lot of life lessons where there were really bad food poisoning events or bowel movements that changed her life. So yeah, trigger warning for that. Those critiques aside, I really enjoyed the audiobook. I love that she reads it because she has this fun and lovable kind of voice. You don't really hear it as a memoir, you kind of hear it as someone kind of telling you their life story in the same room that you're in. And I would listen to this all the time on my commute to school, and it was always a fun pick-me-up because as much as I don't enjoy her humor, she did have a couple little like non-vulgar funny moments in there, so you get some really nice tender moments in there too about her family life, being pregnant, and of course being a woman, an Asian woman no less, in the comedian community. Though her graphic humor isn't really for me, I can appreciate that Wong made a name for herself and so many other female comedians. She really makes it a point to mention that she's fighting against that submissive Asian woman stereotype and how many female comedians are undermined in kind of acting roles and stand-up shows. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. This was a 3-star read for me. It was really light, it was fun. There wasn't really anything too bad about it. It also just wasn't anything life-changing. Any kind of lesson that she taught you or moral of the story she mentioned was kind of just like common sense or stuff that was a little out of reach for us who aren't famous comedians. So yeah, I think if you don't like memoirs or you're afraid that memoirs are a little boring, this one's actually really good to start on. And I also noticed that I read a lot of memoirs that are by comedians. This is like my 7th one and there aren't many left out there. So yeah, good read. The next book I read was Mieko Kawakami's Heaven. I actually found out about this book through trying to find authors that were Japanese and aren't Haruki Murakami. I really can't stand Murakami's work. I think he's super overhyped and the way he writes women is sad and disgusting. So I found out about Kawakami and her prolific background and her nameless novels that are super critically acclaimed in not just Japan, but are now being translated because they're so great. And I loved it. Loved Kawakami's Heaven, and I can't wait to start her latest novel, which I believe is called Breast and Eggs. So in Heaven, we follow this unnamed young boy who's kind of the narrator. He is bullied very intensely because of his lazy eye. It takes place during his middle school years, and he meets this other girl who's also really bullied because of her social status and how she wears the same clothes every day. They kind of form a connection because the both of them kind of have a really hard social life, have a really hard home life, and they write letters back and forth to each other in a way that kind of brings out the best in one another. So the first half of the novel, you're just kind of going through the unnamed narrator's mental stability and how much more he can take, and he keeps on questioning, why are these things happening to me? Is there anything I can do to change the way that people treat me? And on the other side of the spectrum, you wonder why the girl, who is also being bullied, sees the way that they're getting treated, the bullying, so differently. This book is absolutely beautiful. The prose is out of this world. It's written so tragically and yet so hauntingly well done that it really puts you back into that awful middle school atmosphere. You feel really helpless while reading it, but at the same time, you wonder how these characters are going to interact with each other in the following chapter. You have these extremities, I feel, that happen between people. So you'll get moments of absolute apathy and then absolute human bliss. And these are within pages of each other. There's this great interaction between the unnamed boy and his bully about karma and justice and why things happen to anybody. It's just so unnerving. The whole conversation had me like shooken to the core. I have not felt that way about a novel in a long time. So great job, Kawakami. This was a 4-star read for me. It was way too short. I believe it's under 200 pages. There was a lot of loose ends, and I really feel like you had to suspend your disbelief throughout the novel, which I don't mind, but it was kind of like a literary fiction, and I don't give that much of a pass to it just because of it. But yeah, wonderful, wonderful novel. I cannot wait to read more of Kawakami's stuff. The next book I picked up was some easy reading. It was Grown Up Pose by Sonya Lali. This is your everyday rom-com about a girl who is considering a new lover or going back to her ex, all while finding herself. Anu is a woman in her 30s who is a recently single mother and has separated from her husband of 10 years. She's always felt the need to please her mother and father, her husband, her children, her family, her friends, and has never thought to put herself first. She decides to live life her way for once and goes on a trip, opens a yoga studio, and soon realizes that maybe breaking tradition isn't all that good for her. This was actually really fun and really sweet. I really enjoyed the Indian customs and traditions that were mentioned throughout the novel. It made it feel much more authentic of an experience for me. I also really enjoyed that they used Punjabi. I loved getting to know the words that parents and siblings and family friends and lovers would use between each other, and that was made simple enough to understand in the novel. Also, the two main love protagonists are not your average protagonist. They are both Indian. They are both in their 30s. I don't have to worry about reading about another 17-year-old white girl falling in love with her 2 other white guy options. I think I can find the image somewhere. It's a meme that's like this or something. It's just half of YA or romance novels. I have to give it 3 stars. I have to say it's very corny at times, but sometimes you really need corny because it's sweet. It has a lot of your tropes. Girl finding herself through opening a business, perfect daughter finally disobeying her parents, yada yada yada. There was nothing really new that happened within the genre, but it was still a fun romp. So 3 stars. Books like these are just really fun and light, easy reads for me. I also listened to Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Mansala. This was a murder mystery and I hadn't read one in years and I forgot how much fun they were. We're following a woman in her 30s named Leila after a divorce from a horrible marriage, and she's back in her hometown trying to help her aunt or her tita and their family business. Leila's aunt owns a Filipino-themed restaurant, but lately there's been a harsh food critic in town tearing the restaurant down. And this food critic also happens to be Leila's ex-boyfriend. Leila comes back to try and help save the restaurant and maybe help Tita with the reviews that have been tearing the restaurant down. But after one of her meals, Leila finds her ex-boyfriend and current food critic dead at the table, and she becomes one of the most important suspects in this mass murder mystery. I loved this novel. This was such a cozy mystery thriller read. I think that when I usually read mystery thrillers, I'm on edge, but this one really is tagged as cozy on Goodreads, and it really brings that tag perfectly. Obviously, you're in it for the mystery, but there's so much more to it. The family relationships, and not just between Leila and her family, but there's many other restaurants in town that are family-owned restaurants that are different ethnicities, come from different cultures, and they make different foods. And it's so beautiful how they interact with one another. That was a really big part of the novel for me. Also, the food that's mentioned. I think she even has recipes at the end of the novel. They read them out loud in the audiobook too, so correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, there's some recipes on there. And it's so fun because I'm Mexican, And a lot of the recipes that are made in Filipino culture do have a Mexican or Latino kind of basis because, our cooking's very similar. So it was kind of fun to hear adobo and other similar ingredients and recipes. I did find out what was going on about less than halfway through, but I don't take that away from the mystery's rating per se. I never think that it's something that you have to challenge when you're reading a mystery thriller novel. I think that's just part of the fun. You're trying to solve it, right? I give it 4 stars just because there was romance in the novel that wasn't really needed. I think that it was such an afterthought that the main mystery and family relationships shined a lot more in comparisons to the relationship that was in the novel. 4-star read, definitely. Audiobook is wonderful. The pronunciations are on point, so please, if you want to read or listen to this book, listen to it instead. It is a wonderful, wonderful, cozy read. The next book I read was The First Sister by Lyndon A. Lewis. This was classified as a space opera, a queer space opera, no less. And we get 2 main perspectives. We get the perspective of an unnamed priestess, who is the first sister, and she also goes by that title for sister. So sisters are basically women on these spaceships who are allowed to forgive soldiers, but they have no voice, no name, no ownership of anything really, not even their bodies, because they are used similarly to comfort women on the ship. However, there are ranks, and those who are first sister do not have to be used by the entirety of the ship. They're just used by the captain. So it's a really cozy title, and the first sister wants to remain that way. The next perspective we have is through Lito. Lito is a poor kid turned loyalist soldier, barely escaped his last war alive. Now, Lito is caught in another conflict and must choose between his love and their rebellion, or his country and his people. This is an awesome read. I was super afraid to start this because I'm not a sci-fi person. I just don't have the brain power to envision all the laws and space tactics that were going on. I definitely still got lost, don't get it twisted. I had to reread a lot of this stuff to know what was going on, and I definitely played back the audio like maybe 10 times in some instances. But yeah, really fun. The battle scenes were a lot, but I could keep track of what was going on after a couple replays, and the amount of I guess space technology or laws or class systems that were going on weren't too much for me to handle either, so that was really nice. The only thing though is that there are 2 major relationships in this novel, and one of them paled in absolute comparison with the other, and I think that's what makes this a 4-star read for me. I did not care about one relationship in this novel. I thought, okay, it's great that you guys are in love. I just don't see it. It feels a little rushed. The other romance was so much more beautifully written. It was passionate. It was exciting. I got sidetracked to the point where I didn't care about what was happening to the other 2 characters within their romance. And I was so hyper-focused on the main 2 that I had my eyes set on. So yeah, I think the novel suffered a lot from that because I focused more on 2 certain characters as opposed to the whole cast as a whole. But yes, a 4-star read, an excellent space opera, and my first. I think that if you like queer stuff and you like sci-fi, this would be a great read for you. The last book I read was First We Make the Beast Beautiful by Sarah Wilson. This is a part memoir, part self-help, part psychology about anxiety. Wilson herself suffers from immense anxiety in her day-to-day life, and she also talks about having bipolar disorder and how she struggled with depression through much of her life because of it. Let me start off by saying I am not someone who is super anxious, but I do get a little antsy from time to time, and I don't think this book is for someone who is super anxious or has a mental health disorder that makes you anxious. Her sources are really questionable. She goes from sourcing prestigious German universities to a hippie friend she had in high school. The best parts of the novel were definitely the hope and simple tactics she had to battle anxiety. She had a blog in which she talked about her anxiety, and so many people reached out and said, I suffer from the same thing you do, this is what I do. Those suggestions were really well done and thought out and tender in a way. She also just goes out and says it very early on in the book. There is no miracle cure, and there are some people who are just born anxious. some people who never get over it, and there are some people who live with it day to day, and sometimes it's gonna be you. She also had this way of making anxiety sound like an old friend, and I actually really appreciated that approach. I know that a lot of people on the Goodreads reviews did not like that approach, but it was something that I could see myself doing in a case where that was my scenario. What this book lacks is more thorough research and just a general check-in on her privilege. More than half of the experiences she went through were just not relatable content. She talks about how she was raised on a farm and had extremely hand-me-downs. But out of college, she writes for Cosmo, she's a fashion editor, she was on Top Chef, and she almost always had job security. And beyond the job opportunities, she was able to get medication and therapy whenever she wanted, to the point where she would take herself off therapy and medication whenever she wanted. She was out taking soul-finding journeys in India in a yurt with sweat yoga and interviewing people like the Dalai Lama. So I don't think almost anybody can relate to any of these experiences, and I don't know why she included them all. A lot of the reviews I saw that were generally negative about this book were the fact that she could have just excluded all the name dropping, all the celebrities, all the, big name companies that she worked for, and it would have been a great piece, but she felt the need to mention that these things happened to her. So it did feel a little braggy and tone deaf. It got to a point in the novel where she talked about she has it set up to where she can live anywhere in the mountains out of a suitcase for 2 weeks. And I'm like, who in the world can afford that kind of Anyways, I give it 3 stars, even though now I'm starting to think about it and it feels more like a 2.5 star. But I think Wilson means really well. I think all her tactics about hope and just generally learning to realize that anxiety is sometimes going to be a part of you. I also don't think anxiety stops at the privileged or rich or talented. There are plenty of actresses and billionaires, I'm sure, that have anxiety, but maybe don't mention all the wonderful things that have happened to you at the same time you're telling someone who's every day just reading your book off the shelf. On to the manga I read this month. I read Die Dark Volume 1, Q Hayashida's sophomore series after Dorohedoro. Die Dark takes place in a macabre, futuristic space setting, of course, and follows Sanko, a goofy alien teen who's incredibly unlucky. Sanko has a suit of dark and powerful magic bones that make him pretty much indestructible. However, there's a legend going around space saying that anyone who captures Sanko's bones will be given a wish of their choice. So Sanko's basically fighting his way through the galaxy to find out just who put out this wish-bound bounty on him. I'm enjoying it so far. It's really hard to not compare it to Dorohedoro. I think that some of the character aspects are there. Sanko definitely reminds me a little bit of a combination between Noi and Kaimen in Dorohedoro, but it's very unique of a story. It definitely feels more advanced in terms of the storyline, but I think it's gonna be really good. I'm excited to read number 2. I have number 2 on my shelf, so very interesting. Next manga I read was Monster Volume 1 by Naoki Urusawa. This is a crime thriller series that was published in 1994 and still to this day receives critical acclaim and is one of the best-selling manga of all time. It's about the incredibly gifted Dr. Kenzo Tenma and how one of the patients he saved becomes a serial killer at a really young age. In his incredibly specific series of murders, the killer has ties to Tenma that has the doctor questioning just what happened on the night this patient was admitted. Really, really well told. Urasawa has a knack for keeping you hooked within chapter 1. The art style is somehow nostalgic for me. It has a lot of that 90s kind of big eyes, simple hairstyles, and yet beautifully done expressions that I think Urasawa is an absolute master of. Also, the Perfect Edition is stylized in a way that the collector can collect them almost like puzzle pieces. It's really beautiful, and I can't wait to start reading more. I also reread volumes 1 through 5 of Ri Aruga's A Perfect World. This is one of the most beautiful romance mangas out there. It is a romance drama about Kawana, an interior designer who gets reunited with her high school crush, Ayukawa. Ayukawa, she notices, is now wheelchair bound when he was once a popular and celebrated athlete in their high school days. Kawana brushes the old feelings away, but as she spends more and more time with Ayukawa, she finds those feelings coming back stronger than ever. She and Ayukawa try to figure out what their relationship can be because of the countless obstacles that are piling up in their way. This series is so underrated, so beautifully written to the point where you are in tears even after the fourth or fifth time reading certain chapters. And it's not just adding a wheelchair-bound person to check off a diversity checklist. He's a love interest. He's the love interest. And his struggles are displayed thoroughly and respectfully. And Aruga doesn't fetishize him either. Ayukawa's a perfectly normal person, and so is Kawana. She just happens to fall in love with someone who is now in a wheelchair. The love they share is real, and it's constantly being put to the test. And they're not 16 or 17. God, I've read so many dramedies or rom-coms in manga where they're between the ages of 13 to 16, but it's so nice to read stuff that has people within their 20s or 30s or sometimes even older, because I have not been 16 or 17 in about over a decade. And that was it for the stuff I read in June. It wasn't as queer as I would have liked it to be, but again, I'm a mood reader and TBRs are kind of just a basis for what I might read. Thank you for coming back, and if you're new here, you're welcome to stay. I will see you in the next wrap up. Bye!